Okay. Right, folks, good evening. So the NPPF and archaeology. What I'm going to do in my presentation is cover a little bit of elements to the background to archaeology and the planning process before Catherine's going to come in and actually show you the structure and issues in chapter 20. Now, that chapter is specifically about heritage and archaeology, so it's the really important one for us. She's going to then go on and actually look at the issues that we've got about how archaeology is addressed in chapter 20 specifically, before looking at other heritage considerations, and then drawing in the wider NPPF in its totality. And then what we'll do is I'll come back in, summarize our key issues and concerns, particularly around archaeology, before opening up and asking questions. But what I thought would be really helpful to do is just start with a little bit of background to archaeology, the law and planning, and where we actually sit. And in many ways, you've got to go back to look at the fundamental concepts about how we govern the country. And in essence, what you need to understand are the three tiers of government. Okay, so first of all, you have the legislature. That's the Houses of Parliament. That is the body that sets the law. You then have the executive. That is the Prime Minister, the governing party, based in number 10. They set and implement policy. And then you have the judiciary. And what the judiciary are doing is checking that whatever we do is in line with the law that Parliament sets. Okay. Now, this structure is really, really important, especially when you start to think about where archaeology appears in law. And from my perspective, it's a little bit blurry. So we do have the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act from 1979. However, you need to be really clear, that act relates to how we create and manage scheduled monuments. Archaeology appears twice in the section on ancient monuments about a definition of what can be scheduled. So an archaeological site can be scheduled. Okay, but so can lots of other things like caves or buildings or structures. Okay, and it is an act that stands entirely alone. And what I mean by that is it's its own designation regime. So if you are submitting a planning application that includes a scheduled monument, you also have to submit a scheduled monument consent application. You cannot deal with the issues in the planning application, although the planning application would need to deal with the consequences of the scheduled monument, but it stands alone. That's not quite the same for listed buildings, because under the Planning and Listed Buildings Act 1990, listed buildings are considered within the planning remit, as well as having their own consent regime in terms of listed building consents. Okay, so these are the primary two areas where archaeology and heritage are set out in direct legislation. This is the law. We have to comply with this law. As I mentioned, government sets policy. And so that, in a sense, is how it would like that law to be implemented. And in the case of heritage and archaeology, we come under the National Planning Policy Framework. Okay, so this is the document we are going to be looking at. And in essence, this is what makes it really important, because what we're getting here is the government making its statement about heritage and archaeology. So it's a really important document. But we mustn't forget the final of our triumvirate of governance bodies, and that is the law courts. They are there to ensure that anything we do complies with the law. So interestingly, they will test anything, even if it's policy, against the acts of statute. Now, obviously, if the law courts disagreed with the government and overturned policy or action because they didn't think it met the law, the only recourse government has is to change that law. And so actually in the UK, we have a combined legislature that includes the executive. That's when you actually see the government proposing new legislation, primary legislation. Okay, at the moment, we're not there on that, although I will come back to primary legislation because it is really important. What I want to do is just really hone in again on our two key heritage legislation acts. So the really important thing about the Planning and Listed Buildings, the Planning Listed Buildings Conservation Area Act, is it sets a duty of special regard. Okay, so it sets out that everyone should have the special regard for protecting and preserving or enhancing listed buildings and conservation areas. Okay, and their setting. Okay. Scheduled monument legislation, the 1979 Act, only controls the works that affect scheduled monuments. It does not impact or allow consideration of their setting. Okay, those issues need to be dealt with through wider planning legislation. And just to show you where this is really, really important, in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act of 2023, there are two critical provisions for heritage and archaeology. The first is rolling out the special regard requirement to all designated heritage assets. So listed buildings, scheduled monuments, conservation areas, registered parks and gardens, registered battlefields. Okay, that's a really important element. The second element that the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act has brought in is the requirement for statutory HERs. However, there are a couple of challenges because we do need elements of secondary legislation to secure them. Okay, but what I wanted to show you here is whilst we have primary heritage legislation, heritage issues get addressed in a multitude of other acts and other areas, particularly around planning, and those elements can be given multiple different names, hence the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Now, let's go back to policy, because policy in this conversation is key, and it's key for archaeology. Why? Because scheduled monuments in number only are about 20,000, so the legislation is limited to a very few sites. Planning policy really opened that up, and that started in 1990 when we had PPG 16, which effectively introduced the concept that the developer must pay for the consequences of their development and the birth of development-led archaeology. What it also did was allow the consideration of impact on archaeological interest way beyond scheduled monuments. Okay. 4 years later, we get PPG 15, which effectively is the same planning document for the wider historic environment. Okay, so including listed buildings, registered battlefields, and parks and gardens. It opens it up in that way. Now, what's really interesting is we had these two documents, particularly PPG 16, for 20 years with only minor amendments, very minor amendments. They were not rewritten comprehensively. However, in 2010, everything changed. And what we got is a plethora, a deluge of almost every other year, a different government wanting to change planning policy. Okay, so we start with the development of Planning Policy Statement 5 in 2010. And what that does is it amalgamates PPG 16 and PPG 15. It brings them together. Okay, it introduces the idea of substantial harm and less than substantial harm, which we'll come on to later. Okay, it only lasts 2 years. And 2 years it lasts reflects the change in government. The next government that comes in decides it does not want individual planning statements for different items. So the historic environment, the natural environment, roads, pollution, etc. It wanted one document. So it creates the National Planning Policy Framework. Okay, and that is the language you will see and hear a lot of today. Now, what's fascinating is this document has never, ever stayed the same. You may hear both Catherine and I get our chapter numbers mixed up because every time they update the NPPF, they move the chapters around. So historic environment is going to be chapter 20. It used to be chapter 16. So all the numbers all change, but a lot of the text actually stays the same. And really interestingly, This comes in 2012. We get revisions in 2018, 2019, I think there's some in 2020, in 2020, 2023. We get some more, and now we're on 2024 with further revisions. And what's really interesting, in each of those revisions, there is very little change to the heritage chapter, okay? With the exception of the document we're seeing now, where there is substantial changes, and particularly relating to the policies relating to archaeology. Now, before we get onto those, I just want to help you understand again how this all sits into a planning framework, how we make our decisions. So we've gone down through a tiered approach. We've started with legislation. We've looked at policy. There are two other items that sit below policy that you might be aware of. The first is planning practice guidance. So this is further detail describing and elaborating how the government wants its policy enacted. So it's normally written by government, and it normally has a lot of sector leading bodies, so in this case, Historic England, helping to actually shape that guidance. So it's actually a very practical piece of work to actually how it wants its policy set out. And then below that, we have an absolute plethora of advice notes, okay? And so traditionally, you'll have known these as the adaptive reuse of farm buildings, the setting of heritage assets, enabling development in heritage assets, conservation area appraisals, and the good old conservation principles. They all sit in here at this advisory note level. And I have to say, and I'll show this a little bit more in a moment, what they do is they sit at the very bottom of the pecking order. Okay, so when we are creating our advice in planning applications to local authorities, what we have to have primary duty to care of is legislation. It's the most important. It must be complied with. We then move down to what the policy is actually saying. That should be applied. But remember, a law court is going to test if it is applied in compliance with the legislation. Okay. Below those, you then have guidance and advice. And that hierarchy is really, really important, especially if you get to a case where you are in a court of law and there is going to be some consideration around that. Now, why have I set that out in that really clear manner? Well, ultimately, there is no government statement on archaeology, except in the National Planning Policy Framework. So this document is incredibly important for us understanding how the government, if you like, thinks about archaeology. Okay, and so what we are seeing in this document is really important for, in a sense, the status of where archaeology is as a national concern and how much weight it is going to be given in decision making. Okay, so the National Planning Policy Framework is a critical document because we're not going to get primary legislation about archaeology. Okay, so we really only have this document to actually manage archaeology. And I'll give you another really clear indication of that. Those 20,000 scheduled monuments nowhere near equate to the number of archaeological sites or places with archaeological interest we think they are. So the only place we can manage them is actually through development control, planning, and the National Planning Policy Framework. That's the background I wanted to give you. And what I'm going to do now is hand over to Catherine, who is going to take you through the detail.
Thanks, Neil. Right, so yes, here we are. The National Planning Policy Framework as revised. Currently, the consultation is live and it's open until the 10th of March. So as Neil has already said, this is the biggest overhaul of the National Planning Policy Framework since it was introduced in 2012, and it's been brought in to support a whole shift in focus of the government who are looking to develop, growth through development effectively. And so one of the biggest changes that they've brought in is the structure, which is intended to streamline the planning system to facilitate that growth through development. So each of these are thematic chapters that you're looking at in the text on the left-hand side, the contents page. And each of these thematic chapters are split into policies for plan making and policies for decision making. And there's very much an emphasis on a rules-based approach here. So the policies for plan making are supposed to influence the way in which local authorities identify what's distinctive and required in their local area, and decision-making policies will be made against those plans. You can't make a decision based on a plan making policy. They're not interchangeable. So there's a real emphasis on getting the right information up front locally. So there are 3 plan making policies in the historic environment chapter. Sorry. So before we move on to that, thematic chapters, you'll see there's 20 of them. The historic environment comes right at the very end, chapter 20, and that's where I'm going to start focusing on. So the 3 plan making policies, as I said, are for influencing local plan making, also strategic development strategies, which we'll get on to. There's a plan for conservation areas and World Heritage sites. This is a place where the information needs to be stacked up front. So it relies on really good conservation area appraisals. Some places have those, a lot of places don't. And when you come to decision making, it needs to be decided against these plans. So there's a bit of a jeopardy there. There's certainly a lot of pressure on local authority capacity to get that information in place up front. I've lost my place. Right, so the purpose of planning is established in the introduction. The purpose of planning, the planning system, the government says, is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development by managing the use and development of land in the long-term public interest. Now, we can see instinctively the role of the historic environment in achieving that, but not everyone works in heritage. So I've lost my place in my notes. The application of heritage policy is consistently identified as one of the most complex matters for applicants and decision makers. And there's been concern for a while that the way that the current policies are framed in the NPPF really focuses on addressing harm rather than setting out means of positive support for sustainable development. So most of the decision-making policies here are actually a reframing of existing policies, and the objective of the chapter is the same. So within the decision-making policies, HE4 to HE7 are really practical, hands-on means of making decisions, how you secure the conservation and enhancement of heritage assets, assessing the effects on heritage assets, and then proposals affecting designated heritage assets, that's listed buildings, conservation areas, registered parks and gardens, recs, battlefields, and then decisions on non-designated heritage assets. So that would include things which are locally valued. HE8 to HE10 separate out the management of specific types of heritage asset. Now, HE8 and HE9, World Heritage sites and conservation areas, that's about how you manage development within designated areas in a way that ensures that change is sympathetic to their character and appearance, all well and good. HE10, archaeological assets, that's an issue. What's an archaeological asset? So can we change slide, please, Neil? Here you can see a bit of development-led archaeology, that presumably hunting for heritage assets, and this is HE10. What is a heritage asset? If we have a little look here, it's quite clear from the context that they're talking about buried stuff. Archaeology, as I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, is all over the historic environment, and archaeological interest is found all over the place, above ground, below ground, through urban grain, at a landscape scale. But here within HE10, we've got archaeological heritage assets, discovered or undiscovered, should be investigated, and preserved in situ, preferentially, mitigation for any impacts on archaeological assets should be provided for by the investigation, understanding, recording, dissemination, and archiving of that asset. I mean, in essence, these policies are currently in the NPPF, but they've been rehashed and separated out and specifically applied to a type of asset that isn't picked up in any kind of, isn't defined in any glossary anywhere. HE11, the loss or removal of heritage assets, is obviously relevant for archaeology because it's a destructive process. So again, this picks up the gist of policies which are already in there, whereby the applicant should record in advance the understanding of the significance of the asset to be lost in a manner proportionate to its importance and the potential impact upon it. So a bit of copy and paste, but separated out. But yeah, there are issues here. So can we move on to the next slide, please, Neil? An archaeological asset, as I just said, is not defined anywhere, whereas archaeological interest is picked up in the NPPF glossary, and it's defined as there will be archaeological interest in a heritage asset if it holds or potentially holds evidence of past human activity worthy of expert investigation at some point. So that's in policy. Now, expecting that some people on the call, but maybe not everyone, is aware of conservation principles, which is a piece of it's an advisory note to go back to Neil's hierarchy that Historic England produced in 2008, which has been enormously influential on conservation policy around managing change within the historic environment. And it identifies evidential value as one of the four values by which we understand the significance of a heritage asset. So evidential value sits alongside historical value, aesthetic value, and communal value, and it's approximately synonymous to archaeological interest. It's defined as evidential value derived from the potential of a place to yield evidence about past human activity. So you can see that we're talking about the same thing. But conservation principles goes on to explain why this matters and the role that it might just have in understanding the significance of the historic environment around us. So physical remains of past human activity are the primary source of evidence about the substance and evolution of places and the people and cultures that made them. Now, framed like that, you can really easily see that we're looking at something which is much broader than a buried stuff. Another piece that I've picked out from the definition in conservation principles that's important for where we're going to go with archaeology being more applicable to broader ideas is that the material record is the primary source of evidence about poorly documented aspects of any period. That, along with it being related to the people and cultures that made them, oh, sorry, Neil's put something in the text. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to show a lot of text. But we'll move on. Can we have the next slide, please? So we've got multiple issues with HE10 as it stands. First of all, the concept of an archaeological asset is not a defined term. We talk about assets with archaeological interests, which is apparent across the historic environment. Secondly, considering buried deposits separately from other heritage assets is unhelpful. And our third issue is that they're really missing a trick. Archaeological mitigation strategies have the potential to deliver public benefits and social value as part of development in really imaginative ways. There's some fantastic examples of what can be done. And using the strategies to engage local people, which, when it's required through planning conditions, can have really broad range of public benefits. But for that to happen, there has to be a hook in planning policy for those planning conditions to be attached to. So these are the recommendations that we're putting in about how some of these policies could be revised. So HE1, if you remember, is one of the plan making policies. So this requires that to support the conservation, enhancement and enjoyment of the historic environment, development plans should, at the most appropriate level, be informed by a proportionate heritage assessment and should consider the wider social, cultural, economic and environmental benefits that conservation and understanding, is our addition, of the historic environment can bring. And so that is a bit of a hook for archaeology. More so, HE4 is all around securing the conservation and enhancement of heritage assets. Sorry, I've just lost my place in my slides. So to create a hook for improved public benefit outcomes from archaeological mitigation strategies, we think that we need to have this additional text, which is typed in yellow there, added into HE4. And this helps to articulate how archaeological mitigation strategies can enhance the significance of buried deposits. So the significance of heritage assets, particularly those with archaeological interest, but not uniquely, can be enhanced through increasing our understanding and knowledge of them, as well as through activities that contribute social value outcomes, including place shaping strategies. Now, that opens a door for archaeology. It also hooks in with other policies in the wider document. Can we have the next slide, please, Neil? So we're advising to scrap HE10 and to blend the contents with both HE5 and HE11. Now, HE5 is a staged policy around assessing the effects on heritage assets, separating archaeological assets, whatever they are, out from other heritage assets is not helpful, which is why and it needs to be part of the early stages of development of a planning application in order to run smoothly, streamline the process, deliver optimum outcomes, which is why we're advising that this yellow text is added to the bottom. Apologies, I'm going to read it again. So where a site on which development is proposed includes or has the potential to include heritage assets with archaeological interest, an appropriate desk-based assessment should be undertaken, and where necessary, a field evaluation, helping to understand the asset significance and the potential effect on this, which should inform the design, mitigation and implementation of the development. Now, this is not a million miles away from what is already achieved in policy. We're not suggesting anything radical. This is effectively a tweak, and so we're really hoping it's achievable. But the same goes for all our recommendations, to be honest. Let's move on to the next slide. So the other part of HE10, which needs to be fitted in somewhere, effectively belongs in HE11, the loss or removal of heritage assets. So archaeological evaluation is a destructive process. And we're suggesting a redrafting of this policy, which just allows for enhanced public benefit outcomes. So we've added in the text again in yellow. Activities that help to understand the significance of the asset and create associated public benefit may be required to be undertaken by suitably qualified individuals or organisations and secured through the use of conditions or legal planning obligations. We've been working with Historic England, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, CIFA, and ALGAO, the local government archaeological officers organisation, in coming up with wording which everyone could agree on, with the hope that as a sector, as a group, we can speak with a united voice. Now, the last bit in number 2 here, with a formal agreement of legal owners, is around the deposition of archives in local museums and other depositories. That's text which Historic England colleagues have suggested is necessary to deal with a situation faced in managing deposits by museums and archives. So those are the revisions that were recommended specifically regarding archaeology. But to look a bit broader at the chapter, there are good aspects as well. So there's some points that we really welcome. We have a real interest in the CBA Casework team on undesignated heritage. The things which matter to local people matter to local people. How its grading doesn't necessarily have the same pertinence or relevance if you live close by. Identifying non-designated heritage assets can be tricky, and we really welcome the recognition of locally important heritage in terms of local lists, which are referenced as an adjunct to local plans. So they're in HE1. There's a shift in onus to the applicant rather than the planning officer in assessing the significance of any heritage assets which are impacted and minimising harm to that significance. Previously, the onus has been on the local authority rather than the applicant, which has resulted in lots of toing and froing as proposals initially came in unfit for positive outcomes, and so lots of delays that would be caused by needing to have revisions made. So actually this shift in onus is really welcome. There's also policies supporting the adaptive reuse of existing structures, which we really welcome. We've advocated for a presumption in favour of adaptively reusing buildings that are locally valued and contribute to a sense of place for quite a long time. And policies for non-designated heritage assets are reinforced by policies in the climate change chapter around adaptive reuse of existing buildings and consideration of embodied carbon, which is an absolute win-win. The adaptive reuse minimises wasting embodied carbon in the materials, as well as maintaining and reinvigorating local identity from reuse of buildings. So valuable regeneration and pride of place strategies, as well as retaining the archaeological interest of adapted sites. There are some aspects which could be improved on. Some of the terminology used, we think needs revision. So in policy HE1, the sustainable growth is referred to, which should be sustainable development, really. Sustainable development is identified as the purpose of planning and has an implicit reference to the 3 objectives identified as social, economic and environmental objectives of sustainable development. We want that implicit reference. It's really helpful. Sustainable growth, it's hopefully just a typo, but it's not identified in the glossary, which again matters as things, when there's an issue, it escalates. There's a number of times when the word preserve is used instead of conserve, which is it casts heritage considerations as a blocker, whereas the sort of conservation philosophy has really moved on to managing change according to an understanding of significance. And so changing preserve to conserve just better articulates that principle. There's a few policies which lack nuance. So, for example, HE6 states development proposals which would have a positive effect on designated heritage assets should be approved. Well, a positive effect, I mean, it should be an overall positive effect, because there's always pluses and minuses. There's a balance involved, and also in recognition of that balance, maybe it should be supported rather than approved, because there's loads of considerations that need to be taken into consideration. There's a policy for improving energy efficiency in old buildings, which we really welcome, and it's seen as I've lost my place. Yeah, energy adaptation of old buildings is essential, but it needs to be sympathetically achieved, and so just that slight tweak to say that it needs to be sympathetically achieved would avoid maladaptation and the use of inappropriate materials in traditionally constructed buildings. The there are issues with the conservation areas policy in HE9, I think. We totally agree that not every component of a conservation area contributes to their character and appearance, but HE 9.2 doesn't currently include any capacity for decision makers to consider the cumulative impacts of development in the same way that the World Heritage Site policies do. So the unintended consequence of that, in combination with the plan making policy HE2, could be the erosion of the character and appearance of conservation areas and their reappraisal and removal and loss of their designated status. So just to avoid the unintended consequence, there needs to be a tweak there to allow for cumulative impacts. Now, Neil mentioned secondary legislation required for the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. I'm calling it LURA as an abbreviation because there's so many mouthfuls in this. So the government are consulting on whether to implement the extension of the special regard duties for heritage protection. We're really supporting this. At the moment, there's a requirement to have special regard for listed buildings and conservation areas, which was established in the 1990 Act. Now, enacting Section 102 of the LURA would extend this duty to other heritage assets. So that's World Heritage Sites, registered parks and gardens, protected wrecks and scheduled monuments. We're also strongly advocating for a speedy timescale for implementing the provision of Section 230 of LURA, which is relating to HERS, or historic environment records. There's a lot of policies in this, and the whole leaning on a plan-led system, which makes historic environment records an essential element of the data needed to support that plan-led system. Right, next slide, please, Neil. So, other aspects of the NPPF. All the policies that, all of the thematic chapters, which I put a circle around, have a relationship to managing change to the historic environment and or include opportunities where participation with local heritage can support the overarching goals of the government around local identity, community cohesion, pride in place, well-being, net zero targets, regeneration, supporting a visitor economy. At the moment, there are a lot of policies with relevance to heritage without explicit cross-referencing. So one of the things which we're identifying and recommending is cross-referencing. I've put the relevant policies in there. That's what those the list of letters and numbers are. So there are there was some disappointment initially amongst sort of people in the heritage sector who speak to when we're talking about sort of shared advocacy work. There's a bit of disappointment about the historic environment being framed in preservation terms, and we did notice that we're chapter 20 out of 20, and there's a bit of a concern that heritage is viewed as a blocker in the planning system, and we're really keen to highlight the relevance of the historic environment and opportunities it presents towards achieving a lot of the government's goals. Hence the recommendation for the added wording in HE4 about mitigation strategies having the potential for social value outcomes. Now, there are policies with real heritage benefits outside of the heritage chapter. So we really welcome implications for adaptive reuse and policies referencing making better use of vacant and underutilised land and buildings. It'll open up creating homes in next industrial complexes. It'll hopefully lead to more reuse of sites rather than raising the site and developing it from scratch. There are climate change policies and achieving well-designed places policies around taking advantage of opportunities for reuse of existing structures and materials. The policies around design guides, local design codes, master plans, key principles for well-designed places. There's lots of implicit reference to heritage-related stuff without explicitly referencing the relationship to heritage. So again, a bit of cross-referencing. There are also other policies with heritage implications. So there's a real shift in weighting in this rearticulation of the NPPF towards approving development. So within settlements, the principle of a planning balance is tipped by stating proposals should be approved unless the benefits are substantially outweighed by any adverse impacts. That's a new thing. The principle of development outside settlements is similarly subject to a skewed balance, but for specific uses. There's also a default yes for development introduced near railway stations, on grey belt land, and on brownfield sites. So how heritage considerations will come into playing with policies really reinforces the importance of implementing Section 102 of the LURA, that extension of the special regard, because that helps to rebalance the balancing. But HO 11, isolated homes in the countryside, that will have heritage implications. TC 1, planning for town centres. L2, making effective use of land. L3, achieving appropriate densities. GB 7, development which is not appropriate in the green belt. How heritage is weighed against those. The extension of special regard will be really useful, but also identifying the benefits that appropriate management of heritage can bring. It doesn't have to be a blocker. Now, spatial development strategies have been given more detail. They're basically they're plans for future infrastructure at a sub-regional level, which were first articulated in the recent English Devolution Bill. And how they will work and how they'll come together is set out in lots of the plan making policies, specifically PM 2, 6, 8 and 9. Crucially, a good plan-led system relies on good upfront data, and the successful implementation of spatial development plans will really rely on sensitivity mapping across multiple categories. And this sort of sensitivity mapping data is held by all the statutory consultees separately, and it needs compiling into a coherent geospatial database. DEFRA consulted on a land use framework last year, and we haven't heard the upshot of that, but it's going to be quite important in terms of the data to underpin spatial development strategies. But we're going to make a strong argument that coherent, consistent statutory historic environment records should provide the data on historic environment sensitivities that supports development in the right places. PM8 is a key policy to pin this argument to. So it talks about the evidence for plan making and states that all plans should be informed by a baseline understanding of the needs, opportunities, constraints, and wider context of the area to which they relate. And the preparation of plans should then be shaped and underpinned by information and data that is relevant. So the historic environment records really need to be referenced, recorded, like part of that. There are other policies in the NPPF which would really dovetail nicely with the recommended additions we've made for HE4. So HEC1 is about planning for healthy communities and talks about identifying wider opportunities to promote good health, prevent ill health, support social interaction. I don't know if people have seen the recent Heritage and Wellbeing report that Historic England have published, but there's a real connection there. Equally, the idea that design quality should be considered through the evolution assessment and delivery of development proposals in DP4, that would dovetail as well with the additions to HE4. Now, there are some areas which will have quite serious repercussions for archaeology potentially, although it's all about managing that change and having the data up front and the right policies in place to deliver the best public benefit outcomes. But the presumption in favour of development on brownfield, grey belt and sites close to stations are all types of locations where there's quite a lot of archaeological potential. And we're therefore advising the need for site allocations to also consider archaeological potential as a component of policy PM2. And the addition of HER data to site allocations will be a really important part of the stated aim of increasing clarity regarding what development of an allocated site would entail. So to summarise, the historic environment's got a really key role in place shaping and sustainable development, and having the right policies in the NPPF will help us deliver this. So yeah, that's what we're that's how we're responding to the consultation, and I'll hand back to Neil.
Brilliant, Catherine. Well done. Everybody, honestly, you can't get across just how much there is in this document that you've got to get your head around. And you can't just go to the heritage chapter, you've got to do the lot. So Catherine, well done. That was really good, and I really appreciate the thorough that you brought to it. Right, folks, what I want to do is just bring back and just give you some key summaries about where we are on this. So what I want you to remember, that this importance of this document in relation to the government making a policy announcement, a policy shift, and a set of policies we need to adhere to. We need to be responding on this, and we need to be getting our position absolutely right. So for me, there are several really key headline issues. The first one, this slightly weird concept of an archaeological asset. I think that's a really retrograde step, particularly when you understand archaeological interest lies within all other heritage assets, has the potential to be there. So we are really clear. We want to go back to the definition that archaeological interest lies within all those heritage assets, and that is what you should be looking for, archaeological interest of a heritage asset. I think the other thing we're absolutely really clear about, separating out archaeology into policies at the end of this document is dangerous. It's bad. I define it as othering, and it's one step to actually removing. And it actually introduces some false decision making. And as Catherine really put very clearly, you need to be thinking about the archaeology when you're thinking about all of the heritage considerations right at the beginning of any proposal, not at the end, like the document actually seems to set out in this sequential way. So we're really clear. Archaeology needs to be built into the heritage policies as a whole, because they are fundamentally part of the heritage decision making as a whole. Okay. The other thing I think we're really clear about is actually we need to strengthen the role archaeology has in that placemaking conversation, which is absolutely really critical when you start to think about the data and the information we hold in our historic environment records, the knowledge that is actually held in our heritage services that actually manage that information, and the potential that actually sits there. We need the right hooks to really have that pulled out to make a really positive contribution at that stage. But also the better clarity we can get in plan making and site allocations means we can start to address and unlock wider public benefit when we actually get into the potential archaeological mitigation stages, the excavations or the recording stages, or whatever effectively comes next. So really, really important there that we need to actually embed archaeology in the heritage policies to make them sustainable, to make sure they have better links back into legislation. Okay, that being the key. So again, here Catherine's mentioned the LUR Act, which is so important, and that duty for special regard. We need to see that delivered. We need to see the statutory provision of historic environment records actually secured as well to make this process work. So there are the right resources there. The final area where I think we are really keen to see some movement is this idea about how and who benefits from the archaeological works that are undertaken through development. Now, we do amazing archaeology at the moment, and we produce amazing outputs, but primarily they are aimed towards a specialist archaeological audience. Okay, and when you look at the wording, that is what the direction of travel is. We are proposing slight changes to that wording in order to tip the seesaw as to who benefits from the creation of that archaeological knowledge, and how we take steps to better disseminate and work with communities about the dissemination and engagement in that archaeological knowledge. So actually more and wider people can actually benefit directly from this conversation. So the public benefit argument is absolutely critical. And again, it doesn't need whole-scale changes. It just needs that little wording change that Catherine's pointed out to give those much more clearer hooks that we can then build the supplementary guidance and advice notes on around how to do it. Okay, so this is about creating the right scaffolding and structure in order to deliver better outcomes, and outcomes that we think will be more meaningful. So that's really our very quick summary. What I'm going to do now is keep encouraging you to put your questions in the Q&A. And I know you put some in, so I'm going to start putting Catherine on the spot, asking her some of the questions that we've actually come in. Okay, Catherine, are you ready for this?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We'll go down them in order, which is good. Okay. So Adrian asks, what are we going to say about the role of local authorities in all of this? That question came in quite early. Adrian, if you're happy, I think we've answered that question. So the role of the historic environment records is absolutely crucial. But I think, Catherine, you would agree the role in terms of the local plan making is really important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, historic environment records are really patchy in coverage across the country at the moment. Some places have a really well organised one, some places don't. And once they're on a statutory footing, then it levels the playing field a bit, and it creates a lot of data which incrementally helps inform future development. So in places like York, there's a deposit model for what you might expect to encounter in places. Other places they haven't got that. So yeah, to put HERs onto a statutory footing just means that you get incrementally a better idea of what you might encounter in different places.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, Matt makes the statement, I'm quite interested in using the following: HE5, assessing effects on heritage assets. For decision makers should be satisfied that this assessment accurately reflects the effects on heritage assets caused by the proposals.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's a really important point, isn't it? You can do an assessment, but it's sort of got to be accurate and it's got to actually sort of address the issues.
Absolutely, I think that that's an important check and balance paragraph. So the onus is on the applicant to assess the significance of the heritage asset, assess the impact of proposals on that, and the decision maker needs to agree that they've got it right.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Now, here's a really interesting one. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer it, but it is a really good point. Okay, so Joy says, surely this shouldn't only be about human activity, or is there something in another document regarding fossils and stratification? Right, so let's just be clear. I'd just say, first of all, Catherine, we did comment on the historic environment chapters. There is a natural environment chapter, but I think still fossils are one of those things that sort of fall through the gaps.
Yeah, there is one on mineral. There's a chapter on minerals as well. So yes, there are policies in there which come into play for quarrying and things like that.
And obviously, and a lot of the time, what we actually find is in the guidance and the advice notes, that's where that is actually picked up. So again, often with fossils, you're having to go really deep to actually get to those contexts that actually might find those. And again, a lot of archaeological evaluation, when it does encounter that sort of thing, is really interested in that paleo environmental evidence and past environment and how we actually look at that. But I have to say there is no specific thing says you must go and look for fossils. So again, it is interesting how different aspects get actually dealt with. Okay, next up, Tegwin comes in. Hi, Tegwin. I hope you're well. Is there anything around local authorities maintaining conservation and archaeological advisory roles? Great that the onus of assessing significance and minimizing harm has shifted, but the local authority still needs the expertise to check the information developers are providing.
Totally agree. It's the elephant in the room. The pressure on LPAs from both coming up with all these plans and the data in advance, but at the same time dealing with the applications that are coming through the door. The massive implications for local authority planning teams. And I think that the government have promised some money towards additional capacity, but I'm not sure that it's enough. Yeah, it's not written into the NPPF, but it is definitely a parallel issue.
Nick comes in with a similar point. We have fairly bitter experience of poor quality desk-based assessments, absolutely, being done by completely inappropriate people and yet being accepted and discharged by local authorities. Would it be useful to state absolutely explicitly that DBA should only be undertaken by suitably experienced and qualified people?
Oh God, welcome to my world. The amount of letters that we write saying the assessment isn't up to scratch. It's really frustrating. Wales, they have some really helpful scaffolding for good impact assessments, and we do casework in both England and Wales. And just anecdotally, the quality of applications in Wales is so much better. But I'm not sure that's answered the question or not.
Is there any movement to have some of that approach in Wales mirrored in the new NPPF, Catherine?
Well,
any new wording that might help us there?
It would be planning practice guidance that would come through, or even an advice note. And I have shared the Welsh one with colleagues at Historic England, who did, say that they would have a look. But I don't know. I don't know
where it's going just yet.
Only cross my fingers.
Okay, great. Question from Michael: could local plans also include specific reference to parish neighbourhood plans? Now, I think neighbourhood plans are referenced, aren't they?
I think that they are referenced. They are a separate planning document themselves, neighbourhood plans. And I think that a local plan would reference where they ought to be considered, or how yes, they come into play. I think that they sit underneath local plans, but
yes. But there is some specific wording in the NPPF where they deal with them.
I think so, and they're definitely a material consideration in decision making.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so Adrian asks, does the revised draft NPPF deal with the issue of where the artifacts which arise from developer funding excavation are stored post-excavation? I think you referred to this in your one of your last slides, Catherine.
Yeah, so it is an issue. It's a recognised issue, and that was the motivation behind adding the additional wording into HE11 about sharing title. And I know that Historic England got a project going on around archives. It's a recognised issue. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, so the wording is tightened up around the ownership issues, yeah, and the need to deposit them. So again, this is an issue that is well known about and actually is being looked at in more detail. Okay, so Emily asks, are we expecting there will be significant battles to come around the loss of industrial archaeology and heritage on the presumption in favour of development of brownfield, grey belt, railway station sites, etc., etc.?
Well, I would hope that there's policies in a couple of chapters which reference the reuse of buildings and locally listed buildings. The key thing will be to get those sites on the local list. And then they're in the plan, local plan up front, and so they're there for decisions to be measured against. And I would hope that, very much hoping that the policies in well-designed places and in the climate change chapter around adaptive reuse will mean that we see less of that than we are at the moment.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Let's move on. Here's a very nice niche question, Catherine, and you might want to actually just pass this one back to me. Historic England, in a paper in 2018 about watermilling landscapes, leats, mill ponds, weirs, etc., concluded that most individual assets on their own will not merit designation. Their significance is when they are combined as elements of a whole landscape. They suggested the NPPF could help with such landscapes being recognised in local plans. Does this iteration of the NPPF help with this? I think I heard you said that there was no opportunity to consider cumulative impact in conservation areas section. So I think we might be just mixing two things up there a bit. But if we take the first one, do you want me to do that?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, right. Okay, Keith. So I think the issue there is what they're probably saying is they're potentially not, when they're not designatable, it's because they might be too hard to define under the terms of the 1979 Ancient Monuments and Areas Act. However, the important aspect in this document is we do have a footnote. It's footnote 75 now, and it repeats the previous footnote that heritage assets with archaeological interests that are of equivalent significance to a scheduled monument should be treated as if they are designated. And then it goes on to actually note that things aren't scheduled sometimes because they can't be, because they don't fit into the tight definition in the Act. Okay, so in that sense, there is an opportunity for sites like you are describing to be considered of nationally important, not designated, and properly addressed through planning policy work. There is also an opportunity, obviously, in local plans, if that is a distinctive character type of heritage, that a local plan can reflect that in the local plan. And that is where data on the historic environment record really becomes important.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that the local plan guidance or advice notes has been redrafted recently. I'm not sure if it's actually been published, but it's a really broad catch-all group of locally valued heritage, and I would think that anything like that would be at least locally listable, at which point it becomes a consideration.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Keith, on your conversation about the conservation areas, okay, so it would absolutely also depend on whether these features were actually in a conservation area. So again, if they're primarily a rural feature, then they're unlikely to be in a conservation area. But at the moment, there is the wording around cumulative impact isn't as strong as we would like to see in conservation areas. So we will be recommending that is strengthened. Okay. Catherine, next up, do you think research frameworks could help focus information gathering for plan making stages? And will Historic England be revising them to align with planning policy? Not sure you can answer the second part of that question.
Can't answer for Historic England, but I mean, that's got to be a good idea, hasn't it? I think that anywhere where there are research frameworks in place are well worth having identified in the local plan. I would have thought that HE, you could probably tuck that in under HE1. Yeah, I think get proactive on it and put it in front of the nose of people who might be making decisions or drawing up plans but aren't as aware of them as they might be, recognising that historic environment teams at local planning authorities are really stretched. And so anything that enthusiastic people can do to support their work would, I'm sure, be welcomed.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Right. We've still got a few questions to go, so I'm going to see if I can whiz through these and make sure that I'm just ticking them off as we go. So this is Ed Dennison. Hello, Ed. I hope you're well. Ed, very experienced in this area, but he's asked, what is the status of the draft 2025 NPPF? Presumably it's a draft and may well be amended following the consultation. Well, that is what we're hoping, isn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Yes. So absolutely, Ed, the whole purpose is to get this draft amended in the way that we would actually like to see it. Okay, Ian George. Hello, Ian. Lovely to hear from you tonight. I think the paragraph where you propose the alternative wording for field evaluation should be where appropriate and not where necessary, as that begs the question, who says it's necessary?
Yeah.
Okay, we can have a look at that. Thank you, Ian. I know what hat on you've got there, so yeah, we will definitely go away and have a look at that line for you, which is great. Thank you. Next up. Okay, so what protections are you seeking for full historic environment teams supporting LPA planners in additional to historic environment records?
That would be a totally separate piece of advocacy work. We want to see adequate staffing for historic environment teams. Yeah. I think that under the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, there were policies around there's policies around enabling local planning authorities to set their own fees, and that's closely related to them being able to do staffing.
Yes.
It's not an NPPF thing particularly.
But I think it would be fair for us to say, Catherine, that we will say, in order for this to work properly, then local authorities need to be properly resourced. And
absolutely.
All of local authorities. Yeah?
We're very much waving that flag.
Yes. So this process is fundamental to having well-resourced local authorities, or it just doesn't work. So, David, I hope that answers your question there. Beth asks, could the word experience be added back in alongside suitably qualified in describing who should be carrying out the work? Having a degree is very important, but that doesn't mean that everyone is able to write a desk-based assessment, carry out excavations, or being given scheduled monument consent.
Fair enough.
Yep. Okay, Beth, we will definitely have a look at that for you. Question for Nick. How confident are we that the government will not undermine the existing draft? The tone and content of the draft solar energy guidance being circulated very overtly undermines the principle of predetermination evaluation.
Doesn't it?
Can we be confident this approach will not spill out beyond renewables guidance?
Well, we've been to meetings, like sector meetings, with representatives from MHCLG, and we've been working with Historic England colleagues who also have a good connection with MHCLG, and we understand that they are listening. And that's as good as an insurance as we can get at the moment.
I think they understand the challenge of trying to remove predetermination evaluation. And I believe they have been given some strong steer about what that might do in taking us back to a pre-PPG 16 world, which none of us would like to go to. So again, Nick, it's a really, really important point. And again, I think we need to be really clear about why, from my perception, building archaeology back into that overall heritage assessment in HE5 is so critically important, and not leaving it dangling at the bottom in this sort of other section, which leaves us open to just being, sort of airbrushed down. Okay. Right. So question from Hayley. Do we have any written guidance or templates to help us to respond to the consultation? We've had a few questions about this, Catherine. But how are we going to share what we've done already and the presentation, etc.?
I think that Jamie is recording the presentation, and I think we'll make it available as soon as possible. Yes, we are happy to share our draft response. It's not complete yet, so I'm hoping that it will be by the end of next week, and then we're happy to share it. I don't know what the best way to do that is, Neil. Do we put it online, or do we send it to people who ask for it?
I think if you would like to see our draft response, please do get in touch with us, because it is only draft, and we will only make our formal response live and open to everybody when we've actually finished it. And Catherine's got a little bit of work still to do on the wider NPPF. But we're happy to share our draft direct to people if anybody would like it. And so please just drop us an email to the casework at archaeologyuk.org email address. I think I got that right off the top of my head.
Yep.
Which is good. So yeah, we're definitely able to help that. One tip that we've got that you should always do with this sort of guidance: if you want to change wording, you need to list the paragraph wording that you want to change. You need to write what you want it to be, and then you need to say why. So absolutely give them the wording you want. And that is what we'll be doing in our response. So every time we're recommending a change, we will have a table format that is really clear. This is the paragraph, this is the change we want, and this is the reason why.
I think that's really good advice. I think it's important to consider the make it user friendly. Think about the person or the AI on the other end who's receiving this. So make it easy to pick up and use.
Yeah. Right. I'm just going to do one more question here, which is from Elsie, which is brilliant. Would the current provision for public benefit in Scottish planning guidance be something you will refer to, aspire to, in suggestions for the NPPF?
I love that guidance. Well, I love the policy hook that they've got, and then the guidance that supports it. And I reference it a lot, and I bang on about it to colleagues in England all the time. I'd love to see it repeated here. I have referenced it to Historic England colleagues who have made a good note of it. Yeah, we're on the same page.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, we've just had a final quick question in, and I think this might be a bit too difficult to unpack, but I'll give it a go. Not a question as such, but there are some areas like Kent who are undergoing local government reorganisation where planning office may be based outside of the town and heritage locations. Local neighbourhood plans may play a larger role when this happens, but how would this document help if the person doing the assessment is not from the location? I think the process is set out in this document does say that you need the suitably qualified people to actually do this work, yeah, to actually draw those up. And again, Catherine showed you some of the wording there about how, you know, information needs to be in a sense validated and checked. And again, that's a lot easier to do at local plan or neighborhood plan level, where those items can actually be looked at in detail. Catherine, do you want to add anything to that?
No, not particularly. I did just want to add, though, that I think that Jamie's put something in the chat directing people as to how to get in touch if they want us to send them a draft response.
Catherine, thank you so much. I was just about to go on to the chat, which is brilliant. Okay, folks, we've wended our way to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. If you want to put some more stuff in the chat, we can do, or again, you've got the contact details. Please get in touch with us and Catherine directly. I would just like to point out, obviously, we are a charity doing this work. And so any support you can give us, particularly around supporting the Buildings Casework role, and that covers all of this really critical national advocacy to ensure that archaeology is properly catered for in planning process. Please think about giving us a donation. Go onto our website, use our QR code, and you can find out so much more about what we do. I want to give a really huge thank you to Catherine. She's carried the can on this and been absolutely amazing. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we are more than happy to share our draft advice as we've got it so far, if you'd like that, and get in contact with us, and we'll absolutely be sharing the video that we've got from tonight. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.